Hey, it's Alex again, and in today's video, the biggest frauds on Everest are here. From a gym climber with a fabricated reputation who ducked beneath a fence at a condemned wall, to a base camp medic whose forged credentials had gone unchecked by every person whose life depended on him. It was September 14th, 2016, on a regulated Via Ferrata route, threading the eastern limestone face of a dolomite formation in northern Italy, where the steel cable system and iron rungs had been anchored into the rock for a reason that would, before noon, become impossible to dismiss. Luca Bianchini was 24 and worked part-time at a regional sporting goods retailer in the Veneto. He climbed recreationally, weekends, occasional day trips, with enough exposure to feel capable on technical terrain without formal alpine training. Marco Resi was 27, a construction supervisor who had climbed alongside Luca for 3 years. Neither held alpine certification. People who knew them described both as quick-moving outdoors and comfortable on moderate routes. They had arrived that morning with proper equipment. That part was not the problem. The route's entry signage was explicit. Via Ferrata progression required maintaining at least one carabiner on the continuous safety cable at all times. They had read it. Other climbers on the route later told investigators they had watched both men fail to correctly execute the dual carabiner progression system, at times leaving both carabiners improperly positioned during transitions between anchor sections, bypassing correct attachment procedure at narrow sections to avoid lanyard friction. The decision was deliberate and made more than once over the course of the morning. This was highly illegal. Everyone on that route had been told so in writing before they stepped onto the rock. A weather shift had passed through the region in the previous hour. Not rain, but enough humidity to leave the upper limestone surfaces with a damp film, the kind that doesn't reveal itself until weight transfers onto it. The gorge channel below the upper traverse dropped between staggered limestone ledges at irregular intervals, some projecting outward from the wall. A guided tour group of 11 was positioned roughly 200 feet below on a wider ledge section. Their guide later told investigators he had already noted both men appearing to incorrectly manage their lanyard transitions while moving between cable segments and had been watching them. Luca reached the iron rung traverse approximately 80 feet above the gorge floor and stepped onto the first rung without properly completing a carabiner transition onto the next cable section. His right boot slipped sideways on the damp iron. No extended moment of balance, no warning sound, and he grabbed at the surrounding rock with both hands. Nothing caught. His body swung outward and fell. Marco, 2 rungs back and also not correctly secured through a completed dual carabiner transition at that moment, attempted to react. He lost footing in the same motion. The guide described hearing 2 distinct impacts against limestone, the first sharp and immediate, the second lower in the gorge, and roughly 2 seconds behind it. The 2 nearest climbers described the same sequence: 2 contacts against the ledge outcrops lining the channel, and then nothing. Witness accounts for events like this are always shorter than you expect. There's almost nothing to describe because it was over before anyone could process what they were watching. The guide called emergency services within 3 minutes. A mountain rescue helicopter reached the site approximately 35 minutes later and confirmed both died on approach before landing. The coroner determined both deaths resulted from multiple blunt force trauma. The part I find difficult to reconcile is that they had the equipment. Every piece of gear required to walk off that route safely was on their bodies that morning. The Regional Climbing Authority classified both deaths as non-compliance with fixed route safety systems. Local alpine training programs incorporated the case into safety curriculum without formal attribution. Coverage beyond regional outlets was minimal. They were experienced enough to feel capable, and they had likely moved through sections with improper or incomplete Via Ferrata clipping technique before on easier terrain without consequence. That's the logic that builds quietly, decisions that work until they don't. The mountain made no distinction between all the times it had been fine and the one morning it wasn't. On the morning of March 22, 2017, the south side of Mount Hood in Oregon sat locked down. The upper mountain had been shut for 3 days due to unstable snow and sustained winds gusting above 50 miles per hour. Timberline climbing rangers had posted bright orange closure signs at every major access point, and the morning weather briefing warned of refrozen ice on the higher slopes and active icefall in the Pearly Gates chute. Temperatures had plummeted overnight, turning soft spring snow into a brittle shell that fractured underfoot. For most climbers checking conditions that week, the decision to stay off the mountain required no deliberation. But 29-year-old Ryan Caldwell wasn't most climbers. He had driven up from Portland before dawn, pulling into the Timberline parking lot just after 4 in the morning. Ryan had cultivated a modest following on social media by documenting solo climbs on Pacific Northwest volcanoes, often bragging about slipping past closure signs and reaching summits when others turned back. His online persona thrived on the notion that official warnings were meant for tourists and weekend hikers, not serious climbers like himself. Friends described a pattern of escalating risks, each successful climb reinforcing his conviction that caution was optional. He had summited Mount Hood once before, 2 summers earlier, under clear skies and soft snow. That single ascent had convinced him he understood the mountain. What he didn't grasp was how drastically conditions could shift between seasons, or how little his summer experience would count on early spring ice. His pack that morning held a single aluminum ice axe, lightweight crampons designed for moderate terrain, and no self-rescue gear. Rangers who later examined his equipment noted it was suited for a casual glacier walk, not the rock-hard ice waiting above the tree line. Ryan passed the closure signs without breaking stride. A pair of skiers preparing gear near their vehicle watched him step over the barrier and continue up the trail, his headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the pre-dawn darkness. One of them called out, asking if he knew the route was closed. Ryan raised a hand in acknowledgement but didn't stop. Within minutes, his light had disappeared into the trees above the parking lot. The skiers watched until his beam vanished, then exchanged a glance without speaking, assuming he would turn back once he encountered the conditions firsthand. The lower slopes passed without incident. By the time the sun crept over the ridge to the east, he had cleared the tree line and was approaching the Hog's Back, a narrow spine of snow that funneled climbers toward the summit crater. The wind had eased slightly, but the surface beneath his feet told a different story. Every step produced a hollow, almost metallic sound, the unmistakable sign of a deep freeze that had transformed the snow into something closer to ice. A guided group resting near the top of the Palmer snowfield spotted him moving alone far above their position. Their guide later recalled watching Ryan climb in a straight line up the steepest sections, bypassing the safer switchback tracks left by previous teams. His pace looked aggressive, almost rushed, as if he were racing against something no one else could see. The guide made a mental note of the time and continued preparing his clients for their own descent. By mid-morning, Ryan had reached the base of the Pearly Gates, a narrow chute carved between 2 unstable rock buttresses that led directly to the summit crater. The chute had been specifically cited in the closure advisory. Warm afternoon temperatures earlier in the week had loosened ice from the upper walls, and rangers had documented fresh debris scattered across the approach. Climbing through the gates during unstable conditions was considered one of the most dangerous decisions a person could make on Mount Hood. The freeze-thaw cycle had worked on the upper walls for days, daytime warmth expanding fractures, overnight cold, refreezing moisture, and widening cracks until slabs hung by friction alone. Ryan paused at the entrance and looked up. The walls rose steeply on either side, their surfaces streaked with old ice and loose rock. A faint groaning sound echoed from somewhere above, the kind of noise that experienced alpinists recognize as a warning. For a long moment, Ryan stood motionless, his breath clouding in the cold air. Then he stepped forward and began climbing into the chute, committing himself to a route that every official source had declared off-limits. The first 50 feet went smoothly. His crampons found purchase on the hard ice, and his axe bit cleanly into the surface with each swing. The wind funneled through the chute, driving loose snow sideways and reducing visibility to short bursts between gusts. He didn't notice the thin crack spreading through the ice above him, or the way the morning sun had begun warming the eastern wall. The collapse happened without warning. A slab of ice roughly the size of a car door sheared away from the upper wall and dropped straight down the chute. Ryan heard the crack a fraction of a second before impact. He tried to flatten himself against the slope, but the falling ice struck the surface beside him with enough force to shatter into frozen shrapnel. One fragment caught his shoulder and spun him sideways. His axe ripped free, and his crampons lost their grip simultaneously. He began sliding immediately. The surface was too hard, too polished by wind and cold to offer any purchase. His body accelerated down the chute, tumbling once before straightening into a head-first slide. Witnesses below saw a dark shape emerge from the gates and continue down the slope at terrifying speed. There was no attempt to self-arrest. The ice simply wouldn't permit it. Ryan's body struck a rock outcrop near the base of the chute and continued sliding until it disappeared over a roll in the terrain. The rescue team reached him within 90 minutes. He was found nearly 600 feet below the pearly gates, his body partially buried in wind-drifted snow. The injuries were consistent with a high-speed fall on alpine ice, massive blunt force trauma, multiple fractures, and no signs of life. The investigation confirmed what witnesses had described. Ryan had entered a closed road, climbed through a chute under active icefall conditions, and fallen when unstable ice gave way above him. It was April 22, 2014, in the Everest Base Camp area of Tibet. Light snow the previous night had left a fresh dusting on the slopes. An expedition company was running practice climbs before the main summit window opened. Griffin Hartley was 36, a guide hired weeks earlier to lead clients on the North Route. His application listed nearly a dozen Everest summits and extensive credentials. The company paid him at the higher end of the rate scale. In the mid-2000s, verification was done through personal references and self-reported experience. What the company never discovered was that Griffin had summited Everest only once, years earlier, as a paying client, not a guide. He had led trips on lower mountains, but had fabricated most of his Everest experience. He gave convincing answers drawn from publicly available reports. His deception had worked on previous contracts. Griffin was assigned to take 2 clients, both experienced trekkers but new to extreme altitude, on a training rotation to an intermediate camp. The plan was to climb up, acclimatize, then descend the same day. Griffin had been to that elevation only once before. The route involved steep ice faces with fixed ropes and exposed traverses subject to high winds. Weather on the north side often deteriorated in afternoons. Griffin and his 2 clients, Claire Avery and Tom Ochoa, left the lower camp in the morning. Claire carried a helmet camera to document her first high-altitude climb. The climb to their target elevation normally took several hours. Griffin set a pace faster than typical acclimatization protocol, saying they needed to get down before afternoon weather moved in. His clients kept up, but were breathing hard well before reaching the destination. They arrived at the campsite around midday. Griffin's plan had them resting briefly, then heading down within an hour. Both clients were showing altitude effects: headaches, nausea, moving slowly. Claire asked to rest longer. Griffin contacted base camp on the radio, reporting his clients needed more time. Base camp advised waiting until the symptoms eased, suggesting a departure in the mid-afternoon. By early afternoon, winds had picked up considerably. Griffin decided to descend anyway, against base camp recommendations. His clients trusted his claimed expertise and followed. The descent required careful movement down steep ice with the fixed rope as a safety line. Partway down, Claire slipped on a steep section and caught herself on the rope but became tangled and couldn't get her footing back. Griffin, below her, climbed back up to help. Other climbers ascending the route stopped and filmed the situation on their phones. Standard practice for documenting technical problems. The footage captured Griffin's repeated failed attempts to untangle Claire, trying different approaches that an experienced guide would know were incorrect. He fumbled with the rope configuration for several minutes while Claire hung awkwardly. When Claire was finally back en route, the delay had cost them. Winds were stronger and visibility was getting worse. Griffin pushed for faster movement. Tom began showing serious altitude sickness, vomiting, and confusion. Griffin radioed base camp asking what to do. Base camp told him to descend immediately and support Tom as best he could. A short time later, Tom collapsed on the slope. Griffin and Claire tried to help him, but got no response. Griffin called for emergency assistance. A rescue team was dispatched from below, but would need over an hour to reach them. Griffin's radio communications over the next period were later reviewed. He reported Tom's condition worsening and said he couldn't move him alone. Base camp instructed Griffin to stay with Tom, while Claire descended on her own for safety. Griffin sent Claire down. She reached the lower camp after dark with assistance from the rescue team she met partway. The rescue team found Tom unresponsive in the early evening. Griffin was showing hypothermia and exhaustion. They confirmed Tom had died and evacuated his body the next morning. The incident prompted the company to verify Griffin's background when they reviewed Claire's helmet camera footage and videos from other climbers. The recordings showed Griffin's handling of the rope emergency, his uncertainty, incorrect techniques, and trial and error approach visible in detail. An experienced climber who had filmed the rope incident submitted his footage, noting Griffin's methods seemed amateur. Cross-checking his claimed summit dates against records confirmed only his single client summit from years before. Medical examination determined Tom had died from brain swelling caused by altitude sickness, worsened by extended exposure during delayed descent. Reviewers noted the camera evidence revealed critical decision-making failures: the premature departure during building winds, the rope handling incompetence, and delayed recognition of Tom's deteriorating condition. The footage contradicted Griffin's claimed expertise at every turn. His certifications were pulled, and he was removed from the guide registry. It was March 14, 2019, on the northwest face of a restricted 8,000-meter peak in the Himalayan range, where the nearest legal expedition was camped 3 vertical miles below, and the only witnesses to what happened were the mountain itself, and one man who would spend years trying to forget it. Davin Cho was 38 years old, a structural engineer from Bishkek, who had built a secondary career as a high-altitude guide for private clients across Central Asia. He had summited 4 8,000-meter peaks legally, 2 of them twice. He had spent the better part of 2 years organizing this particular attempt for 2 clients, brothers Ruslan and Fenabayev, businessmen from Almaty in their mid-40s with money, ambition, and a compressed timeline that made the official permit queue impossible. Davin knew what to do because he had done this before. He bribed the right people, kept the paperwork thin, moved fast. This illegal maneuver had always worked. The Abayev brothers weren't reckless. Ruslan had 2 7,000-meter summits. Fen had one. They trained, hired, and paid seriously, about $14,000 each, for an arrangement that manipulated checkpoints, head counts, and permits. Nothing about this was impulsive. They made calculated decisions, which makes the outcome harder to process. They chose a 48-hour weather window, starting March 13th, moved efficiently, and summited at 2:10 p.m. on March 14th. Up to that point, every decision had worked. Above 7,600 feet, the northwest face turns into steep blue ice and wind-packed névé, exposed to sudden pressure shifts. Davin cut the descent short by taking a couloir, about 400 vertical feet faster, but riskier, and one he'd only used once in better conditions. Around 2:40 p.m., pressure dropped 18 millibars in under 2 hours. A station 90 kilometers away recorded it, but didn't relay it in time. Winds jumped from 25 to 65 miles per hour within an hour. On paper, it looks minor. On the mountain, it isn't. Davin was leading the descent into the couloir when Fen, the younger brother, lost his front points. The ice beneath him had a glazed layer under the wind crust, the kind of surface that looks solid but has no bond below the top centimeter. His crampon caught, torqued, and he went down. The fall was approximately 200 feet before he hit a rock band. Ruslan, rope behind him, was pulled immediately and violently. The anchor Davin had placed held for roughly 3 seconds before the screw sheared at the collar and released. Davin was not yet clipped to the anchor and took the force of both men's weight traveling downhill. He was pulled off his feet, slid 40 feet before self-arresting, and when he looked back up the couloir, both men were below the rock band, neither moving. He reached Fen first. The man was breathing but unresponsive, positioned face down across a flat ledge with his left leg bent at an angle that eliminated any possibility of walking. Ruslan had come to rest 30 feet further down, against a secondary rock feature. He was not breathing. Davin checked for pulse for over a minute. This is where the account becomes genuinely hard to read. Davin's later statement describes the silence as the most disorienting part. Fen remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, then gradually fading in the cold. Davin activated a personal locator beacon at approximately 4:55 p.m. The nearest legal expedition, a South Korean team camped at 6,900 feet on the standard south route, received the relay signal through their base camp coordinator at 5:22 p.m. 2 of their members reached Davin at roughly 9:40 p.m., nearly 5 hours after the beacon was triggered. Fen was already unresponsive. Ruslan's body remained where it was. Neither man was listed in any official climbing registry for that date or that route. When the South Korean team filed their incident report, they identified Davin only by first name and nationality. The form had a field for expedition affiliation. It was left blank. Ruslan's body was recovered by a private team the following autumn, funded quietly by the family. The checkpoint officer who had logged their entry as a supply run had by then been reassigned to a different post. The liaison officer had submitted a resignation. The families were told there had been an accident on the mountain. No official report was ever filed that named the route, the date or how 3 men came to be in a restricted zone with no legal record of their presence. Fenn's body was recovered months later in a separate operation arranged quietly by the family. And this is just one story of an illegal group that died on Everest. There are many more documented deaths. What stays with me is that the corruption didn't kill them. The mountain found them anyway, and the system they had bought made sure no one would ever officially know. Everest has always been lethal, but now some of that danger is being introduced, not inherited, just like social media. It was March 4th, 2017, on a glaciated high-altitude corridor in the Khumbu region of Nepal, where the air above 17,000 feet doesn't feel like cold. It feels like pressure, weight distributed against every exposed surface of your body. 3 days into his climb, Dmitry Sokolov had not yet reached the elevation he needed for the footage he came to get. He never would. Dmitry was 29, a travel content creator from St. Petersburg, with a few thousand mostly Eastern European followers. He built his audience on stage summit clips and borrowed gear. Climbing forums had flagged his footage more than once for fabrication. None of it slowed him down. He had entered Nepal on a tourist visa, then moved through lower Khumbu trekking corridors using standard park entry permits while deliberately avoiding the separate expedition permit system required for technical ascent above regulated icefall zones, and bypassed formal expedition registration requirements on the upper route. No guide, no registered expedition, and no official log. Bypassing the permit system was planned. Guides meant restrictions on where he could film, and restrictions likely meant a worse product. He had positioned himself just outside monitored expedition groups, moving intermittently through congested mixed traffic sections, where independent trekkers and permitted expedition support teams briefly overlapped, close enough to follow their established route, far enough to avoid being documented. What didn't hold was everything after. He had been on the route for hours when Sherpa guides on a permitted expedition ahead noted his movement, stop and start, camera extended on a long rig, hands rarely free for balance. The section ahead was a narrow glacial choke point, locally known for active Sirac instability directly above the line. At least 2 climbers passed through and warned him verbally to keep moving. He did not. The afternoon overcast had flattened the light across the ice by the time he reached the choke point. The slope beneath his crampons was compressed névé, layered over older ice, uneven in ways that weren't visible until weight shifted onto it wrong. Hanging ice formations above the route had been visibly active for days. A Sherpa guide and his client, positioned roughly 40 to 50 meters below, had paused to assess their footing and had a clear, unobstructed sightline to what happened next. Dmitry stopped directly beneath the hanging formation. He extended his camera rig behind him and stepped backward to frame the shot. His left crampon caught a fixed rope anchor frozen into the root surface. The Sherpa later told investigators there was no buildup. 1 second he was upright, the next he was going backward. The twist put him onto the slope sideways. He reached for the camera rig instead of the ice. The slope offered no friction. He began sliding within 2 seconds and accelerated past any corrective movement almost immediately, over roughly 500 feet of broken terrain. He struck a sequence of irregular ice steps, wind-carved ledges, and fractured snow shelves that deflected his body unpredictably rather than producing a uniform tumble. The Sherpa described each impact as a visible deflection, not a tumble, but a series of hard redirections, each surface lowering his speed just enough for the next one to register. 500 feet is a long way to not stop. No safety equipment deployment was observed at any point. He disappeared below a ridge break and did not reappear. The Sherpa radioed down route within 12 minutes, reporting a critical fall with no stop point. A rescue helicopter arrived approximately 1 hour later, but could not land due to wind shear and slope angle. Ground recovery teams reached the site after nearly 4 hours. He was dead on the spot. I'm still not entirely sure what I feel about this story. He made choices that were illegal, deliberate, and ultimately fatal, but none of them included actually wanting to die on that slope. What stays with me isn't the permit violation or the fabricated content back home. It's that the mountain didn't distinguish between any of those choices, and the outcome was going to be the same regardless of how good the shot would have looked. By September 14, 2015, in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, Australia, the afternoon heat had settled into the valley, and the sandstone cliffs glowed orange in the late sun. A section of wall known locally as Cathedral Ledge had been fenced off for nearly 4 years, ever since a series of unexpected rockfalls had killed 1 climber and injured 2 others. Rangers had installed permanent barriers, posted warning signs in 3 languages, and added motion-activated cameras after reports of trespassers. The closure wasn't a suggestion. It was a legal prohibition backed by fines and potential prosecution. But 26-year-old Marcus Ellison had never let signs stop him before. He was a gym climber from Sydney who had transitioned to outdoor bouldering 2 years earlier, building a small following on social media by posting videos of himself on routes other climbers avoided. His style was aggressive and photogenic, heavy on dramatic angles and light on safety gear. Friends described him as charming but reckless, someone who treated risk as content rather than consequence. Marcus had driven to the Blue Mountains that morning with a plan. He wanted footage of himself free soloing a route on Cathedral Ledge, a climb that would be impossible to replicate legally and therefore impossible for anyone else to match. The closure made it more attractive, not less. He parked at a pullout nearly a mile from the main viewing area and hiked through the scrub to approach the cliff from an angle the cameras couldn't cover. The sandstone at Cathedral Ledge was ancient and weathered, shaped by millions of years of wind and water into features that looked solid but often weren't. The rock was layered, with thin bands of harder material sandwiched between softer stone that crumbled under pressure. Water seeped into invisible seams during storms, dried, and left the bonds between layers weaker each season. Climbers who had worked the wall before the closure knew to test every hold twice and avoid any feature that looked flaky or hollow. Marcus had never climbed sandstone of this type. His experience was limited to granite boulders and plastic gym holds, surfaces that behaved predictably and rarely failed without warning. He reached the base of the cliff around 3 in the afternoon. The wall rose nearly 200 feet above him, its surface broken by horizontal cracks and shallow ledges. A faded sign wired to the fence warned of unstable rock and prohibited all climbing activity. Marcus ducked under the barrier, set up his camera on a small tripod, and began chalking his hands. He wore no harness, carried no rope, and had told no one where he was going. The only precaution he had taken was leaving his car unlocked in case someone needed to retrieve his belongings. The first 30 feet went smoothly. The holds were larger than expected, and Marcus moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had spent years training indoors. He paused briefly on a ledge at 40 feet to shake out his arms and glance down at the camera below. The angle was perfect. From that height, the valley stretched out behind him in layers of green and gold, a view that would have been worth the climb if the rock had been reliable. Above the ledge, the rock changed character. The sandstone became visibly more weathered, with pale streaks running down the face where water had eroded softer layers. Several holds that looked solid from below turned out to be hollow, producing a dull thud when Marcus tested them. He adjusted his line, moving left toward a vertical crack that split the upper wall. At 70 feet, Marcus ran into the first serious problem. A foothold crumbled the instant he weighted it, sending a shower of orange dust down the cliff. He caught himself by jamming his hand deeper into the crack, but the movement cost him balance. He spent several seconds pressed flat against the wall, breathing hard. A wiser climber would have recognized the warning. Marcus saw it as a challenge. He continued upward. The crack narrowed as he climbed, forcing him to switch from hand jams to finger locks. His forearms began to burn. At 90 feet, he reached for a horizontal edge that would allow him to rest. The edge looked solid, a clean line of darker stone that protruded slightly from the surrounding rock. He wrapped his fingers over it and pulled. The hold came off in his hand. Not a small piece, but the entire edge, a slab of sandstone roughly the size of a dinner plate that had been attached to the cliff by nothing more than friction. The failure was instant and total. Marcus's weight shifted backward as his grip vanished, and his other hand couldn't compensate fast enough. His body peeled away from the wall in a slow, almost graceful arc. He fell without a sound. The camera captured everything. His body rotated once in the air before striking a ledge at 40 feet, then continued tumbling to the ground. When rangers discovered him the following morning, after a hiker reported an abandoned camera near the closed section, Marcus was lying face down in the scree, his chalk bag still clipped to his waist. The investigation was brief. The failed hold revealed a network of internal fractures invisible from the surface. The rock had been poised to fail for years. After his death, rangers extended the restricted zone and installed additional barriers. It was October 19th, 2014, on the northern approach to Mount Fuji 8th Station, where the trail markers end and the mountain stops pretending to be hospitable. The closed season gates had been standing since early October, bolted, signed, and largely ignored by anyone willing to walk around them. Kenji Morita was 26 years old and worked as a freelance graphic designer in Osaka's Namba district, taking contract work from small brands and local publications. He planned carefully, he researched locations, and he had completed 2 prior Fuji ascents during the official summer season. Daiichi Arai, 25, was a warehouse logistics coordinator and Kenji's closest friend since university. The two had been documenting outdoor trips together for roughly 18 months on a shared social media account. Nothing massive, a few dozen followers, mostly friends and local outdoor enthusiasts. This trip was planned as their marquee content, an off-season summit push, the kind of footage that looked different from the thousands of summer season clips already online. The trail closure was not ambiguous. Orange barriers sat across the 5th station access path, with laminated notices in Japanese and English, citing volcanic instability and freeze-thaw deterioration of the upper slopes. Other friends mentioned that Kenji had read forums where other hikers described successful off-season attempts, treating the closures as bureaucratic excess rather than legitimate hazard assessment. That reasoning isn't hard to follow when dozens of people report doing something without consequence. The warning starts to feel performative. They illegally bypass the checkpoint before dawn, hiking the lower trail by headlamp and reaching the 8th station area by mid-morning. Neither of them had crampons. The frozen ash and volcanic gravel on the upper slope had the surface texture of packed sand, but none of its stability. They reached the ridge bypass, a narrow traverse used informally by experienced climbers to avoid the switchbacks near the closed upper gate. A patrol ranger conducting a periodic perimeter check roughly 400 yards below the bypass later described seeing 2 figures on the upper slope moving laterally across the ridgeline. He had already radioed other personnel when Kenji's lead foot slipped on a thin frozen crust over loose ash, sending a short cascade of gravel downslope. He described the sound first, a brief scraping slide, followed by loose material skittering downslope. Not loud, more like dry grit shifting under weight. Then Kenji's figure pitched forward as his footing failed, dropping from vertical to horizontal in less than a second. I don't think most people understand how fast a slope transition happens at that angle. There's no scrambling, no recovery window, nothing. The ranger described him sliding face down across the ash field, accelerating almost immediately, arms out. The camera gimbal still in his left hand for several yards before it separated. He began to rotate and bounce unevenly across the hardened surface. He did not slow. At the ledge break, a roughly 30-foot drop onto a lower volcanic bench, he went over the edge and out of the ranger's line of sight entirely. A group of 4 climbers descending below the bench heard what one later described as 2 separate impacts in quick succession. A dense, flat sound followed immediately by a second. They did not see the fall. They saw Daiichi above them, already moving toward the ledge break, shouting. Daiichi reached the edge, looked over, and stopped moving for several seconds before pulling out his phone. He reached emergency dispatch within 5 minutes of the fall. Ground rescue teams reached the lower bench approximately 90 minutes later and declared Kenji dead. The local prefectural authority released a brief notice referencing illegal seasonal entry. It received almost no national coverage. Daiichi did not post anything publicly afterward, and the shared account went inactive the following week. I've read a lot of these cases, and the silence that follows is always the part that lingers longest. It was May 18th, 2016, in the Khumbu region of Nepal. The weather had been unstable for weeks, with heavy snowfall and high winds at the upper camps. A narrow weather window had finally opened for the following day, the first clear opportunity in nearly a month. Dane Merrick was 41, a corporate lawyer from Seattle with experience on 2 other high-altitude mountains. He had paid substantial fees to an expedition company that advertised itself as exclusive, promising small group sizes and carefully managed summit attempts. Dane had trained for over a year, completed his acclimatization climbs, and passed all required health assessments. His expedition leader assured him their team would have priority positioning for the summit push. What Dane did not know was that the company had sold the same departure slot to 3 other groups, creating over 20 climbers scheduled to leave simultaneously. The company had deliberately overbooked the time window to maximize revenue during the limited season. Internal records revealed they had accepted full payment from all groups for the same slot, calculating that weather or illness would reduce actual numbers. The owner had been under pressure from investors and had inflated projected client numbers. By the evening before Summit Day, nearly all the clients across all groups were healthy and determined to go. The route had been recently fixed with ropes. Weather forecasts showed the window would be brief. In the early morning darkness, all the teams left the high camp simultaneously. Within the first hours, the single-file rope line compressed into a slow-moving queue. By dawn, dozens of climbers from various expeditions were stacked at the narrow sections, steep rock and ice passages with room for only one person at a time. Dane reached the bottleneck in the early morning. His oxygen supply showed more than half remaining. The summit was still hundreds of feet above. Climbers ahead were barely moving. The temperature was extreme. Multiple climbers were filming the ascent on helmet cameras and handheld devices, footage that would later contradict everything the company had promised about small, managed groups. As morning progressed, Dane had climbed only a fraction of the remaining distance. His oxygen gauge was dropping steadily. His guide radioed down, requesting permission to retreat, but the mass of climbers made movement in either direction nearly impossible. The rope line had effectively locked in place. Radio transmissions captured the guide reporting Dane was becoming less responsive. When Dane's oxygen supply ran out, he sat down on the fixed line and did not get up again. His climbing partner, positioned just behind him, later described watching Dane stop moving. Other climbers had to carefully unclip and maneuver around him, a dangerous and time-consuming process in the crowded conditions. Several other climbers in the queue also stopped advancing. The temperature was rising, and afternoon winds were building. Dane remained sitting at high altitude while his guide, responsible for other clients as well, could not physically reach him through the crowd of people. When a team finally reached Dane hours later, after most climbers had cleared the area, he was already gone. His oxygen system was completely depleted, and his equipment had frozen. The altitude and approaching darkness made recovery impossible. Investigation uncovered the company's booking practices when surviving climbers submitted their helmet camera and phone footage. The videos showed the massive gridlock and clearly captured climbers from multiple expedition companies, all wearing different team colors. Visual proof contradicting the promised exclusive, small group experience. Time-stamped footage from various angles documented over 20 climbers bottlenecked simultaneously, with several film conversations between confused clients realizing they had all been sold the same departure slot. The scheduling system had flagged the overlapping reservations weeks earlier, but management overrode the warnings. Digital correspondence showed the owner had written that natural attrition would solve the problem. The camera evidence made the company's deception undeniable. Promotional materials promised intimacy and control, while the footage showed chaos and abandonment. The company lost its operating permits and faced criminal fraud charges. Multiple families pursued legal action, with the video documentation serving as primary evidence, though Dane's body was never recovered. It was October 19th, 2022, on Everest's upper southeast face, during the autumn post-monsoon window, when a storm system that no forecast had predicted with accuracy began sealing the mountain from the top down like something closing a door. There is no single victim in this story. That is the problem. What can be reconstructed comes from fragments. A private forum thread archived by a user in Tbilisi before it was deleted, 2 satellite communicator pings that never resolved into a distress signal, and a series of photographs recovered from a memory card found near the balcony at approximately 27,600 feet during a permitted spring 2023 expedition. The card belonged to a woman whose face appears in several of the images. She has not been identified. One photograph shows her smiling at roughly 26,000 feet, oxygen mask pushed to one side, the South Col visible below her. The date stamp reads October 17th, 2022. Nobody has come forward to name her. I've been sitting on this case for a long time, specifically because there's no clean center to it, no single story, just a series of absences where people used to be. What the forum thread establishes imperfectly is that between 8 and 11 individuals reached the upper mountain during a 2-week window in October of 2022. Each through different arrangements, some connected through private networks, some apparently operating without any outside knowledge of their attempt. At least 3 appear to have had prior high-altitude experience based on their posts. 1 who used a handle that translates roughly from Russian as clean line, described a solo attempt on a non-standard approach corridor east of the standard southeast ridge route. His last post was dated October 14th. It described wind building from the northwest at a rate he found faster than expected. The thread received no reply to that post before it was taken down. A storm system moved in on October 18th. It was not classified as severe by regional meteorological services. Sustained winds of 55 to 70 miles per hour at summit elevation. Temperatures dropping to approximately negative 58 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill factored conservatively. For a permitted expedition with established camps, fixed ropes, and a support team monitoring from below, those conditions are serious but survivable with correct decision-making. For individuals with no established high camps, no fixed rope access, no monitored communication, and no team tracking their position, the same conditions represent a closure with no exit procedure. The storm held for 5 days. What I find hardest to convey is that the storm itself wasn't exceptional. The mountain didn't do anything unusual. It just stopped being survivable for people who had no margin. The Sherpa team that reached the balcony in May 2023 during a commercial expedition's acclimatization rotation sent a private message to their expedition leader that was later described by 2 people who read it. The message used the word several. It described bodies positioned close together near the eastern edge of the balcony shelf, in a configuration suggesting the individuals had stopped moving and not fallen, which is consistent with hypoxic collapse and exposure, where the body simply ceases without violence. One body was partially buried under wind-deposited snow. At least one appeared to have been there since the previous autumn, based on the degree of freeze-thaw weathering visible on exposed equipment. No photographs from the Sherpa team's observation have been made public. The expedition leader did not file a formal incident report, citing uncertainty about jurisdiction and the absence of any identifying information. A regional mountaineering authority was contacted informally and reportedly advised that without identification, no official process could be initiated. I contacted 2 people with knowledge of that communication. Neither would go on record. That tells you something about how this kind of thing gets managed. No remains were recovered or transported. Based on environmental data and witness description, probable cause of death for multiple individuals is exposure and hypoxia following entrapment at high altitude during sustained storm conditions between October 18th and 23rd, 2022. No identities confirmed. No autopsies performed. No official death certificates issued in any jurisdiction. The memory card with the woman's photographs was turned over to a regional authority and has not been publicly referenced since. The number of people who died on that section of mountain during that window remains uncertain. There is no formal count because there was never a formal presence. They arrived outside every system built to record them and died outside every system built to respond. Somewhere in a filing cabinet or a digital archive, there may be a notation, informal, unresolved, waiting for information that will never arrive. More likely, there is nothing at all. That is the part I keep returning to. Not that the mountain took them, but that the world has no mechanism even to notice they are gone. It was the spring of 2016 on the southeast face of Mount Everest, Nepal. The route, approached from the Nepal side, is the most traveled path to the top. A progression of camps, fixed ropes, and increasingly hostile terrain that ends at one of the most precisely documented points on Earth. That season, the mountain's summit window opened for a narrow stretch in mid to late May. Callum Halder was 36 years old at the time of the expedition. He worked as a personal trainer and part-time wilderness guide in a mid-sized city in Montana and had built a legitimate outdoor resume. Multiple summit climbs across the Rocky Mountains, and a guided ascent of Denali in Alaska in 2013. He was not a professional climber, had no Himalayan experience beyond Denali, and held no advanced technical certifications. But he was physically conditioned, consistent in his training, and had been working toward Everest since at least 2014, not as a casual ambition, but as the credential that would confirm everything he had been telling clients and his community about what was possible. That background mattered because it made everything that came later much easier to believe. Halder was not wealthy, and he made no effort to appear otherwise. The funding for his expedition came together over roughly 18 months. Personal savings set aside from his training work, a crowdfunding campaign that drew contributions from people in his local community, and backing from 2 regional outdoor retailers who attached their names to his effort in exchange for promotional visibility. He raised approximately $44,000 in total, which for a mid-tier guided Everest expedition through a smaller Nepali operator in 2016 was a workable number. It was not a luxury operation. It reflected the story he had been telling about himself for 2 years. An ordinary person doing something extraordinary without the resources most people assumed you needed. He talked about Everest in interviews with local publications and at community events in the kind of understated, matter-of-fact way that reads as genuine rather than performative. He described the training, the cost, the commitment it required while working a regular job. The retailers who backed him did so because the story was exactly what outdoor brands want to associate with: accessible ambition, relatable sacrifice. By the time he left for Nepal, there was already a small but engaged community of people following his progress and expecting him to come back with exactly the result he would eventually claim. The spring climbing season on Everest runs from late April through late May, with the viable summit window typically compressed into a narrow period when the jet stream pulls far enough north to reduce wind speeds at the upper elevations. That window can last anywhere from a single day to several days, depending on the year, and in 2016 it was relatively tight. Temperatures above 28,000 feet during that period regularly dropped to between -20 and -30 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained wind exposure along the upper ridge. Visibility above Camp 4 was variable and depended heavily on the behavior of upper mountain weather systems that move through without much warning. The physical environment above that elevation is genuinely hostile to human survival, and that context is important for understanding what the evidence eventually showed about where Halder actually went. The southeast ridge, the standard commercial route from the Nepal side, follows a defined progression from base camp upward through the Khumbu icefall, continuing through the intermediate camps before arriving at Camp 4 on the South Col at approximately 26,000 feet. From there, the summit push moves through a section called the Balcony, then toward the south summit, and beyond that, a narrow knife-edge ridge traverse, the Hillary Step, and finally the true summit at 29,029 feet. The vertical distance between the south summit and the true summit is just over 300 feet, but that final stretch occupies some of the most exposed and technically demanding terrain on the entire mountain. What does it actually take to cross those final 300 feet? The answer to that question is exactly what separated Halder's claim from the reality the evidence would eventually confirm. Halder booked with a smaller Nepali guiding company, one that provided the required permits and baseline logistical support, but maintained far less rigorous internal documentation than the larger operations with decades of Everest history behind them. Larger, more established Western guiding companies offered a higher degree of oversight, Sherpa coordination, and verification throughout the climb, but they also charged considerably more than his budget allowed. The smaller operator was a practical choice given his funding. It was also a structural one that shaped what came later, because in the absence of thorough documentation practices, the space for an unverified claim to persist is considerably wider. Nobody was building a paper trail on Halder's behalf in real time, and that absence worked in his favor for longer than it should have. Halder arrived at base camp in mid-April 2016 and completed the standard acclimatization rotations along the normal schedule, reaching camps 1 and 2 before returning to base camp to recover ahead of the summit window. There were no reported concerns about his physical condition during that phase. He moved through the process without incident and was cleared by the guiding company's local coordination to proceed toward Camp 4 when the summit window approached. Everything up to this point was legitimate, documented, and consistent with a credible expedition. What changed came 2 days before the summit push. On May 17th, the guiding company redirected Halder's assigned high-altitude Sherpa to another client group that had been given operational priority. High-altitude Sherpas are not supplementary to a commercial Everest expedition, they are central to it. They carry spare supplemental oxygen, assist with navigation along the fixed ropes above Camp 4, and provide the kind of direct support that allows climbers across a wide range of abilities to function at extreme altitude. Losing that dedicated escort was a meaningful change in Halder's operational situation. He was informed of the reassignment and chose to continue toward the summit without it. For a highly experienced, self-sufficient climber, moving without a Sherpa escort above Camp 4 is not unusual. For someone at Halder's documented level, no prior 8,000-meter experience, one guided high-altitude ascent on record. It was a significant constraint, and it meant that when he came back down and made his claim, there was no Sherpa who had been with him the entire way who could confirm or deny what he said. That detail would matter more than anyone realized at the time. What also mattered was that Halder knew the upper mountain well enough to talk about it convincingly. He had been above 26,000 feet. He had felt what that altitude does to the body. He had moved along the fixed ropes, experienced the darkness of the Camp 4 departure, and understood the way the ridge behaves in the hours before sunrise. That first-hand knowledge became the foundation of every interview he gave when he returned. He did not need to invent the atmosphere of the place. He had lived inside it. All he had to do was move the finish line, and he had been above 28,000 feet long enough to describe arriving at it in terms that sounded nearly impossible to dispute from the outside. Halder departed Camp 4 at approximately 11 p.m. on May 18, 2016, on supplemental oxygen and moving independently. Conditions at the South Col at that time were within an acceptable range. Wind speeds were manageable, and visibility along the lower portion of the ridge was sufficient for movement in darkness, which is standard for summit pushes on this route. On paper, the attempt looked normal. The problems were in the timing, and they were already there from the moment he stepped off. Moving above 26,000 feet, a zone where the human body is absorbing roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level, means that even physically conditioned climbers slow to a fraction of their lower altitude pace. And that pace drops further as elevation increases. For climbers without prior 8,000-meter acclimatization, the body's response above 28,000 feet is often unpredictable. Reaction times slow, decision-making becomes impaired, and physical output drops substantially even with supplemental oxygen running. Most commercial climbers at Halder's experience level require between 9 and 12 hours to reach the summit from Camp 4. Given his 11 p.m. departure, that placed his theoretical summit arrival somewhere between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. on May 19th. That window is where the weather data becomes critical. Meteorological records for the upper southeast ridge on May 19th showed wind speeds increasing sharply above 28,800 feet after approximately 8 a.m. Other climbers who reached the true summit that same day had departed Camp 4 between 9 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. the prior night, and arrived at the top between 7 a.m. and 9:15 a.m., giving them the margin they needed before conditions deteriorated. Halder's 11 p.m. departure placed him behind that curve from the start. The GPS device he carried recorded his arrival at the balcony at approximately 4:30 a.m., a pace consistent with the slower end of what would be expected for a climber of his experience level at that altitude. By the time he reached the balcony, the climbers who genuinely summited that day were already moving above 28,500 feet. The GPS device recorded continuous elevation and position data throughout the entire climb. Track log data recovered from that device later showed his highest recorded position on May 19th at approximately 28,690 feet, the area of the South Summit, the broad snow platform that sits before the knife edge ridge leading toward the Hillary Step and the true summit. The track showed him stopping at that elevation for roughly 18 minutes before beginning a continuous descent. There was no upward movement beyond that point at any time during the push. The South Summit is a genuine and serious place. Standing there puts a person above nearly every other point on Earth. Many experienced climbers have turned back there under entirely defensible circumstances. But it is not the summit of Everest, and the 300-foot gap between the two involves the most technically demanding terrain on the entire route. Halder's GPS track showed no movement through any of it. Two Sherpas affiliated with the guiding operation encountered Halder during his descent that morning and later provided independent statements to a mountaineering authority. Both described observing him descending from the South Summit area, not from any point above the Hillary Step. Their accounts were consistent with each other and with the GPS record. Halder completed his descent to Camp 4 and continued down to base camp without incident. When he arrived, he reported to the guiding company's local coordinator that he had reached the summit of Everest. No formal verification process was initiated. What no one at base camp knew, and what Halder had no reason to flag, was that every device he carried during the push had been recording the same information the entire time. The GPS unit was still storing its track. The camera's altimeter had logged its reading at the moment of capture. The timestamps were intact. None of it had been wiped. He had come back down with a complete, detailed record of exactly where he had been, sitting quietly in the equipment he packed into his bag. That record was not going anywhere. What followed back in the United States moved faster than most people in the climbing community expected. Halder returned in late May 2016 and announced his summit publicly with a framing that was almost perfectly constructed for the moment. A working-class guy from a small Montana city. No wealthy sponsors, no professional team, just years of training and a 2-year-old goal that he was now saying he had achieved. Within days, regional media had picked it up. Within 2 weeks, he had given multiple interviews, appeared on at least 2 morning programs, and was invited to speak at a local school. A regional outdoor brand signed him to a sponsorship agreement. A publishing contact reached out about a potential memoir. A local government office issued a formal commendation in his name. He was treated in every functional sense as someone who had done exactly what he said he had done. What made it particularly effective was that Halder never oversold it. He spoke about the cold, the exhaustion, the psychological weight of the upper ridge with the kind of specific measured language that only someone who had actually been on that mountain could produce, because he had been on that mountain. Every detail he offered about the experience below the South Summit was accurate. The fabrication was narrow and surgical. He had simply shifted the finish line down by 340 feet and stayed quiet about where he had actually turned around. The story was built on a foundation of real experience, which is exactly what made it credible to everyone who heard it. And that credibility held until one photograph changed everything. The single image Halder associated with the summit showed him in full oxygen gear and goggles, face completely obscured with a high elevation backdrop visible behind him. To any general audience, it read as a legitimate summit photograph. The apparent altitude, the sky, the surrounding snow, it was convincing to anyone who had not personally stood at the true top of Everest. And that was almost everyone who saw it. The photograph circulated alongside his claim for weeks without scrutiny, shared by the retailers who backed him and the outlets that covered his return. The story was clean, the resume was real, and the image seemed to confirm what he was saying. What nobody had thought to look at yet was what the photograph itself was quietly recording. The recognition kept building through June. His story had been picked up in 2 regional outdoor publications. The local government commendation was formalized. The sponsorship agreement was signed. The publishing contact was progressing. Every institution that had attached itself to his name had done so on the reasonable assumption that a man with a legitimate mountaineering background, a real expedition behind him, and a photograph at altitude was telling the truth. That assumption was not unreasonable. It was just wrong. And for anyone watching from the outside, Callum Halder's story appeared to be moving in exactly one direction. But inside the climbing community, specifically among the people who had been on Everest during that same spring season, a different kind of conversation had already started. The first indication that something was wrong did not come from a journalist or a formal investigation. It came from climbers who had been on the southeast ridge on May 19th and were privately comparing notes in the weeks after Halder's announcement. Several of them had been on the upper mountain that same day, and none of them recalled encountering him above the South Summit area during the push. That alone was not proof of anything. The upper mountain is large, and it is entirely possible for climbers to miss one another in those conditions. But it was enough of a question that a few of them began looking more carefully at the details Halder had made publicly available, and the photograph was the first place they looked. One reason the concerns took time to surface was the nature of the climbing community itself. Accusing another climber of fabricating a summit is not a casual act. The social cost of making that claim incorrectly is significant, and the people who had doubts about Halder's account were deliberate about not moving on instinct alone. They compared observations privately before saying anything beyond their own circles. They checked their recollections against the documented timeline. That caution slowed the process, but it also meant that by the time concerns began to move into wider circulation, they were coming from multiple independent sources who had each done their own work. That distinction shaped how the eventual findings were received. Climbers who had personally stood at the true summit of Everest examined the image and identified the same problem independently. The true summit, when viewed from the peak itself, presents a very specific visual geometry. The ridgeline drops sharply away in multiple directions. The sky sits low and immediate, and there is no wide, flat snow platform visible behind a person standing at the top. The backdrop in Holder's photograph was wider and flatter, consistent with the South Summit platform rather than the true peak. The horizon line sat differently than it should have. Multiple climbers with personal summit experience noted this without coordinating with one another, which gave the observation a weight it would not have carried from a single source. But visual analysis of a photograph, however informed, has limits. What came next did not. Halder had described his summit photograph in interviews as having been taken at the top, shortly after he arrived. But if that was true, why did the image file tell a completely different story? The embedded altimeter data recorded by the camera at the exact moment of capture placed the location at 28,704 feet, more than 300 feet below the true summit. This was not an interpretation or an estimate from an outside observer. It was a number the device had automatically written into the file at the time the shutter was pressed. A camera altimeter carries some margin for error, but that margin is measured in tens of feet, not hundreds. The gap between 28,704 feet and the true summit at 29,029 feet was 325 feet, and no calibration variance in a standard consumer camera closed a distance that wide. The photograph he had offered as confirmation of his claim had instead recorded the precise elevation of where the claim fell apart. The timeline was the next thing to unravel under scrutiny. Halder had placed his summit arrival at approximately 9:40 a.m. on May 19th, which on the surface sounded plausible given his 11 p.m. departure from Camp 4. But was that timeline actually consistent with what was happening on the upper mountain that morning? The verified summiteers who reached the true peak that day had departed between 9 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. and were already descending from above the Hillary Step before 9:30 a.m. For Halder to have reached the true summit at 9:40 a.m., departing a full hour or more after those climbers, he would have needed to move faster than all of them, despite having less high-altitude experience and no Sherpa support. The GPS track confirmed he was at the balcony at 4:30 a.m. and at his highest point by mid-morning, but that highest point was 28,690 feet. The math of his own stated timeline could not place him at the true summit. It placed him exactly where the devices showed he had stopped. The Sherpa evidence was the final piece that closed the remaining space. Halder had been careful in his public account never to make specific claims about what the Sherpas he encountered on descent had observed, likely because he understood that those accounts could not support what he was saying. If he had genuinely crossed the Hillary Step and stood at 29,029 feet, who on that mountain had actually seen him above it? The two Sherpas who encountered him on his way down that morning gave their statements separately, without contact with the people already examining the photograph and the GPS data. Both placed him descending from the South Summit area. Neither described observing him at any point above the Hillary Step. Two independent witnesses on the mountain at the relevant time, both drawing the same boundary around where he had actually been. Combined with the altimeter reading, the GPS track, and the weather data, the picture was complete. The investigation that followed brought together a network of climbers and outdoor investigators with direct knowledge of the 2016 season. 4 independent sources of evidence were examined separately: the GPS track log, the embedded altimeter reading in the photograph, the Sherpa statements, and the upper mountain weather records from May 19th. Each one arrived at the same conclusion without the others. Halder's highest point on the mountain had been the South Summit at approximately 28,690 feet. He had not crossed the Knife Edge Ridge. He had not passed the Hillary Step. He had not reached the true summit at 29,029 feet. What made the GPS data particularly difficult to argue against was its completeness. The device had recorded a continuous track from base camp through every movement during the summit push. Not a single data point, but a full, unbroken record of everywhere Halder had been on the mountain and at what elevation. The track showed him ascending steadily from Camp 4 through the night, reaching the balcony, continuing upward to the south summit, stopping at 28,690 feet for approximately 18 minutes, and then descending without deviation. There was no gap in the record, no period during which the device had stopped logging. The track was complete, and it told a complete story. For someone maintaining that GPS calibration error could explain the discrepancy, the device's manufacturer stated vertical elevation accuracy of roughly plus or minus 30 to 50 feet under standard operating conditions made that argument impossible to sustain against a gap of over 300 feet. The numbers simply did not allow for it. What compounded the GPS evidence was how naturally each piece of information reinforced the others without any of them having been gathered in coordination. The photo-terrain analysis came from climbers who had not yet seen the GPS data. The altimeter reading was pulled independently after the terrain concerns were raised. The Sherpa statements were given to a mountaineering authority through a completely separate channel. None of these sources needed the others to reach their conclusion. And yet every single one of them arrived at the same elevation, the same location, and the same finding. The two Sherpas who encountered Halder on his descent gave their statements separately, without prior contact with the investigation network, and both described observing him descending from the South Summit area, neither placing him above the Hillary Step at any point. A mountaineering authority formally noted his claim as unverified and inconsistent with the available evidence. No official summit certificate was ever issued under his name. And given that certificates in standard practice are processed through the operator promptly following a confirmed ascent, the fact that the guiding company had never moved to issue one said something on its own. The consequences came without ceremony and without any single dramatic moment. The regional outdoor brand terminated the sponsorship agreement. The publishing contact stopped responding. The local government commendation was rescinded. Halder offered a brief response, maintaining that GPS calibration error could account for the discrepancy, a claim that no technical review supported, and that no authority formally engaged with after the device's accuracy specifications were established. The argument went nowhere and was not revisited. No criminal charges were filed. The crowdfunding campaign he had run before the expedition did not explicitly promise a summit outcome to contributors, and the legal threshold for a fraud claim on that basis was not met. He was not formally barred from future Everest attempts. No centralized mechanism existed to enforce that without a criminal finding. But within the guiding and mountaineering world, which operates through a relatively connected network of operators, coordinators, and Sherpa teams across Himalayan expeditions, his standing was finished. The investigation record circulated in that world, and it remained the primary documented account of what had happened on the mountain in May 2016. The summit claim was never reinstated, amended, or revisited by any party. It was September 4th, 2018, on the southwest face of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park, California, a wall that has ended the ambitions of better prepared people than Conrad Gillis, and has never once cared about the difference. Conrad was 30 years old and worked as a freelance graphic designer out of Sacramento. He had been base jumping for roughly 2 years, logging jumps from bridges and low cliff exits in Nevada and Oregon. He was not part of any formal jumping community and had no certified wingsuit or cliff-based training on record. People who knew him described someone meticulous about equipment and dismissive about process, the kind of person who reads every manual but skips the prerequisite. El Capitan had been a stated goal of his for over a year. He had researched the wall extensively, studied established routes on the southwest face, and planned to follow sections of a known line. And his laptop documents and online footprint showed a planned ascent to avoid ranger contact entirely. No permits, no registration, a night start time to clear the monitored approach trail before first light. Illegal base exits from El Capitan have a long history, and plenty have been executed successfully by people far more experienced. Conrad had climbed enough to move on moderate granite, and believed his jump experience translated to an understanding of the wall's exposure. He didn't account for how climbing El Capitan alone at night with a loaded base pack alters every move, shifting his balance, snagging on the wall, and reducing precision when it matters most. He was free climbing short sections with the rig high on his back, amplifying the risk. Two nearby climbing parties saw him by early morning, assuming he was experienced until he began stopping for long periods in easy sections. A team about 200 to 300 feet below could hear his movements in the still air, listening as he worked above them. By mid-morning, he entered a steep, exposed section with minimal holds. The lower team watched him spend minutes adjusting his pack and pilot chute instead of placing protection, noting his movements looked strained and unsteady for that terrain. I've read a lot of accounts from people who witnessed falls, and the detail that stays with me most from this one is how much time the witnesses had to watch before anything happened. His right foot came off the hold first. The lower team saw his body pull backward from the wall, not a lunge or a push, just a slow loss of contact that gravity finished. He hit the wall within the first 30 feet of the fall, his left side catching a sloping feature and spinning him outward. At that point, investigators believe he reached for and pulled his pilot chute. Under any normal base exit, that decision would be made from a clean, stable body position with clear air beneath you. On a vertical wall mid-fall, it is not a deployment, it is a last reflex. The canopy emerged from the container and began to inflate unevenly as it came into the airstream, with the lines still close to the wall and his body not fully clear of the rock before the fabric made contact with the granite almost immediately during that partial inflation. It didn't collapse immediately. For a few seconds it snagged and partially reinflated in brief pulses against the rock before losing tension again, tangled in the container, hardware, and the remaining lines. The lower team described the sound of repeated impacts, dull and irregular, as Conrad and the knotted system of fabric and equipment continued down the face. He passed behind a major ledge break and out of their line of sight. The impacts they could hear stopped. What's scary here isn't the fall itself, it's the seconds before it, watching someone slowly run out of options in plain sight. 3 separate emergency calls reached Park Dispatch within 4 minutes of the fall. A rescue helicopter was on site approximately 25 minutes later. Rangers spotted him along the fall line near the base from the air and then confirmed his position on the ground. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The Park Service issued a brief statement referencing unauthorized high-risk ascent activity and confirmed no other climbers were injured. Honestly, what frustrates me most about this one is that it was preventable in a dozen different places, not just at the wall, but in the months before he ever touched it. Conrad just prepared for a version of this that didn't include the weight on his back, the night start, and what it actually feels like to be alone on 4,000 feet of granite with no one checking your decisions. The morning of June 8, 2016, broke clear on the Emmons Glacier route of Mount Rainier in Washington state, with temperatures hovering just below freezing and a light wind pushing scattered clouds across the summit. Rangers had flagged a new route through the glacier the previous week, marking safe passage with bamboo wands after several crevasses had opened near the traditional line. The flagged route added nearly an hour to the approach. Climbers were instructed to stay on the markers at all times. Deviation was explicitly prohibited. 34-year-old Daniel Ashford considered the detour a waste of time. He was a software engineer from Seattle who had been climbing Rainier for nearly a decade, summiting via different routes each season and logging more nights above 14,000 feet than most recreational climbers accumulated in a lifetime. His experience had made him efficient, but also impatient. He trusted his instincts more than he trusted the judgment of rangers who, in his view, erred too far on the side of caution. 10 years on the mountain had taught him its patterns, but patterns shift faster than memory can track. Daniel had arrived at Camp Sherman the previous evening. During the briefing, a ranger stressed the importance of staying on the flagged route, explaining that recent warm temperatures had destabilized several snow bridges and opened new crevasses in areas that had been safe the week before. Daniel listened politely, but said nothing. He had already resolved to take a more direct line across the glacier, one he remembered from a climb 3 years earlier. He left camp at 2 in the morning, well ahead of the other parties. The flagged route curved to the right almost immediately, skirting a depression in the glacier that hadn't existed the previous season. Daniel paused at the first wand, studied the detour ahead, then turned left and began walking directly across the unmarked snow. The surface felt firm beneath his boots. The overnight freeze had hardened the top layer, and his crampons bit cleanly with each step. He moved quickly, his pace driven by the knowledge that other climbers would soon be following. The glacier stretched out around him in shades of gray and blue, its crevasses hidden beneath a uniform blanket of white. For the first 20 minutes, the shortcut worked exactly as Daniel had expected. He crossed two shallow depressions without incident and skirted the edge of a larger crevasse that he recalled from previous years. His confidence grew with each successful step. The flagged route was visible to his right, marked by distant headlamps moving slowly along the approved line. He was already ahead of them. That small victory felt like validation, proof that the detour was unnecessary and that his judgment had been sound all along. The snow bridge that failed beneath him gave no warning. One moment, he was walking normally. The next, the surface collapsed in a perfect circle around him, and he dropped straight down into darkness. His arms shot outward instinctively, but there was nothing to grab. The walls of the crevasse rushed past in a blur of blue and white, and then he struck the bottom with a force that drove the air from his lungs. The fall was nearly 60 feet. Daniel landed on a narrow shelf of ice deep within the crevasse. His left leg folded beneath him at an angle that sent immediate signals of catastrophic damage. Above him, the hole he had punched through was already beginning to close as loose snow filtered down from the edges. The light from his headlamp revealed walls of ancient ice pressing in from both sides, groaning faintly as the glacier shifted around him. The blue walls seemed to press closer with each passing hour, and the cold cut through his layers as though they weren't there. He tried to call for help, but the crevasse swallowed sound. The other climbers on the flagged route were too far away to hear anything, and no one at Camp Sherman knew he had strayed from the approved path. Daniel was alone, injured, and trapped in a place no one would think to search. The cold began working immediately. Crevasse temperatures hovered well below zero, and Daniel's clothing couldn't compensate for prolonged exposure in a frozen pit. His fingers grew numb within the first hour. His injured leg became a source of constant agony that made sleep impossible. He rationed his water, tried to stay calm, and waited for a rescue that might never come. By the time search teams located him the following afternoon, triangulating his position from the tracks that led away from the flagged route, Daniel had been in the crevasse for nearly 36 hours. Rescuers found him conscious but hypothermic, his core temperature dangerously low, and his injured leg showing signs of severe frostbite. He died during the helicopter flight to the hospital. The official cause was listed as complications from hypothermia and traumatic injuries sustained during the fall. Rangers updated their briefings for the remainder of the season, but the glacier continued to shift. April 27, 2014. On the Avalanche Gulch route of Mount Shasta in Northern California, the forecast that morning had been unambiguous. A fast-moving storm system was approaching from the Pacific, expected to reach the upper mountain by early afternoon, with sustained winds above 60 miles per hour, and heavy snowfall reducing visibility to near zero. Rangers had issued a voluntary evacuation advisory for climbers above 10,000 feet. Most teams took the warning seriously and began breaking down their camps. 27-year-old Kevin Marsh decided to stay. He was an aspiring mountaineer from Sacramento who had attempted Shasta twice before, both times retreating due to weather. This was supposed to be his redemption climb. He had taken time off work, purchased new equipment, and driven 5 hours with the sole goal of standing on the summit. The approaching storm felt like a personal insult, another obstacle thrown in his path by a universe that seemed determined to keep him from the top. Kevin had established camp at Lake Helen, around 10,400 feet. The morning was calm and clear, with only a thin ribbon of clouds visible on the western horizon. It was hard to believe that dangerous weather was only hours away. Kevin convinced himself the forecast was exaggerated, that he could make a fast push to the summit and return before conditions deteriorated. He left camp around 9 in the morning, climbing light with only water, food, and an emergency bivvy. The first few hours went according to plan. Kevin climbed steadily, passing several descending parties who warned him about the incoming weather. One guide later said, Kevin had the look of someone who had already decided, polite, but not listening. The sky remained clear, and the wind stayed light. It was easy to dismiss the warnings as excessive caution. The clouds arrived faster than predicted. By early afternoon, the western sky had transformed from pale blue to a wall of gray, advancing with visible speed. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind began to build. Kevin was above 13,000 feet when the first gusts hit, strong enough to stagger him sideways. Snow began falling immediately, thick and wind-driven, reducing visibility to a few dozen feet. He should have turned back, but the summit was close, perhaps 2 hours away, and Kevin had invested too much to quit. He convinced himself the storm would pass quickly. It was the kind of logic that sounded reasonable in the moment and catastrophic in hindsight. The storm intensified. By the time Kevin reached the red banks at roughly 13,500 feet, the wind had become a sustained roar. Snow accumulated on every surface, filling his tracks almost as fast as he made them. The route markers had vanished beneath fresh accumulation, and the terrain ahead offered no landmarks. Kevin attempted to descend. He turned around and began retracing his steps, but the storm had erased any evidence of his ascent. The wind shifted direction, pushing him off course without his awareness. His compass went unused because removing his gloves meant risking frostbite. He navigated by instinct. His instincts were wrong. The wind-loaded slope released above him without warning. Fresh snow had accumulated on a layer of older, weaker snow that couldn't bear the additional weight. The fracture propagated across the slope in less than a second, setting the entire surface in motion. Kevin heard the sound before he felt the impact. A deep, resonant whump that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The avalanche swept him off his feet. He tumbled through churning snow, unable to tell up from down. The debris flow accelerated as it funneled through a narrow section, compressing and hardening as it gathered momentum. When the slide stopped, Kevin was buried under nearly 4 feet of consolidated snow, positioned face down with one arm extended above his head. He was still alive when the snow settled. The air pocket around his face provided oxygen for a few minutes, but the weight pressing down made it impossible to breathe deeply. Each exhale compressed the pocket further. Each inhale became more difficult. He couldn't move. He couldn't call for help. He could only wait in the darkness as his breathing grew shallow and eventually stopped. Search teams found his body 2 days later. His emergency bivvy was still in his pack, unused. His beacon had never been activated. The investigation noted the storm had arrived within the predicted window, and avalanche conditions had been explicitly mentioned in the morning advisory. Kevin had all the information he needed. He had simply chosen to believe the rules applied to everyone but him. The date was May 3, 2018, in the Khumbu Icefall on Mount Everest. The morning sun had been heating the glacier for nearly 3 hours, softening the ice that held massive seracs in place and increasing the likelihood of collapse with each passing minute. The icefall doctors had closed the passage at 9 o'clock sharp, as they did every day when temperatures rose above the safety threshold. Climbers who hadn't completed their crossings were required to wait until the following night, when the cold would refreeze the ice and restore a margin of safety. 31-year-old Thomas Eriksson had missed the window. He was a commercial client from Norway who had paid a substantial sum for a guided Everest attempt, his first expedition to the Himalayas. Thomas was fit, motivated, and deeply frustrated by what he perceived as excessive caution. The icefall closure seemed arbitrary to him, a bureaucratic restriction that prioritized liability over achievement. His expedition leader had been clear. No one was to enter the icefall after the closure. The seracs were unstable, the ladders were shifting, and the consequences of a collapse were unsurvivable. Thomas nodded during the briefing, then returned to his tent and began preparing his gear. He planned to cross alone and reach Camp 1 before anyone realized he was gone. In his mind, the closure was a guideline for slower climbers, not an absolute rule for someone who could move quickly through technical terrain. He entered the icefall around 11 in the morning, nearly 2 hours after the official closure. The route wound between towering seracs, some larger than buildings, their surfaces groaning and cracking as the sun heated the ice. The sound was constant, a low, irregular popping, like distant gunfire, as ice adjusted to the warming air. The ladders spanning the deepest crevasses flexed under his weight, their aluminum rungs already warm to the touch. Thomas moved quickly, his focus narrowed to the path ahead. Sweat gathered beneath his helmet despite the altitude, and his breathing grew ragged in the thin air. The first warning came as a sound, a deep, resonant crack that echoed through the icefall like a gunshot. Thomas froze, scanning the seracs for movement. Nothing seemed different. He waited 30 seconds, then resumed climbing faster than before. The second warning came as a vibration. The ice beneath his crampons shuddered briefly, a tremor passing through the glacier like a wave. He looked up at the nearest serac, a massive pillar of blue ice leaning slightly toward the route. A fresh crack had appeared near its base, a dark line running horizontally across the surface. The pillar was shifting. He should have run. Instead, he hesitated. The ladder crossing ahead was only 50 feet away, and beyond it lay a more stable zone. Thomas calculated he could make it across before anything happened. The calculation took 3 seconds. The Serac took 2. The collapse began at the top. A house-sized chunk of ice separated from the main pillar and dropped straight down, shattering on impact and sending fragments spinning in every direction. The rest of the Serac followed a moment later, toppling forward in a cascade that accelerated as it fell. Thomas ran. His crampons tore at the ice. His arms pumped. His lungs screamed for air. But the icefall was faster. The debris caught him from behind. Blocks of ice ranging from the size of televisions to cars swept through the route, obliterating ladders, filling crevasses, and burying everything in their path. Thomas was struck by a fragment that spun him sideways, then engulfed by the main flow. The noise was overwhelming, a roar that drowned out everything else. Then silence. Sherpas at base camp heard the collapse and radioed the icefall doctors. A rescue team assembled within the hour, but the debris field was too unstable to approach. They waited until late afternoon before picking through the wreckage. Thomas was found near the center, partially buried beneath blocks that had crushed everything around them. His injuries were catastrophic and instantaneous. The investigation confirmed what everyone already knew. Thomas had entered the icefall after closure, ignored multiple warnings, and been killed when a Serac collapsed onto the route. His expedition issued a statement emphasizing he had acted against explicit instructions. The icefall doctors reinforced their protocols. But in the Khumbu icefall, where the ice never stopped shifting and the Seracs never stopped falling, the lesson was already plain. The closure existed because the mountain didn't negotiate. It didn't care about ambition or frustration or money. It only cared about physics, about the weight of ice and the weakness of flesh, and about the immutable fact that some rules couldn't be broken without consequences. It was April 9th, 2016, on the southern approach to Mount Everest in Nepal. Pre-season preparations were well underway. Teams of specialists had been installing ladders across crevasses and anchoring safety lines through the ice. The work was technical and hazardous. Anders Frost was 33, working as a safety coordinator for a large expedition outfitter. He had spent 2 previous seasons on Everest in logistics and had presented credentials in technical rope systems and anchor assessment. His job was to inspect rope installations and verify they met safety standards before clients used them. What was never verified was that Anders had not completed his certification training. He had attended an introductory course but never passed the final examination. His understanding of proper assessment was incomplete. To save time, Anders had been filing reports claiming installations met specifications while skipping thorough checks. One section of the icefall route involved a crevasse crossing using aluminum ladders lashed together across the gap. The ladder system was secured with anchor systems on both ends, ice screws and pickets designed to hold under stress. Anders was supposed to inspect this crossing, verify anchor integrity, and document it met safety standards before clearing it for clients. Anders arrived at the crossing with a camera to photograph the installation, standard protocol. He took several photos, then filed paperwork, stating it met all requirements. In reality, he had not tested anchor points, assessed ice quality, or verified load capacity. His time-stamped photos showed he spent less than 8 minutes at the site. After Anders cleared the route, it opened for climbers heading up to acclimatize. Early that morning, a group approached the ladder crossing. Several were filming their ascent. Ian Bridges, 29, a client from Colorado on his first Everest attempt, clipped his safety line to the fixed rope and started across. Ian was about halfway when there was a sharp crack from the anchor point. Climbers on both sides had cameras running, capturing the rope suddenly going slack, then snapping tight. The anchor system had started to fail. Some anchor points had pulled free from the compromised ice. The remaining anchors held temporarily, but the rope angle changed and the ladders shifted. Ian lost his balance and grabbed the rope. His jerking weight put extra stress on what remained. Another crack followed. More anchors pulled out. The ladder system tilted sharply. Ian was still attached by his safety tether, but the final anchor points could not hold everything. They ripped free. The entire anchor failed. Multiple cameras captured the ladders dropping into the crevasse, held only by the far anchor. Ian, still clipped in, swung hard into the crevasse wall. Rescue efforts started immediately. Climbers on the far side tried to haul Ian up using the rope. but the far anchor was now supporting weight it had not been designed to handle alone. The far anchor started to slip under the unexpected load. The rope dropped several feet before catching again. Ian was now deep in the crevasse, hanging from a stress system. Radio calls went out for rescue equipment. A team with proper gear was dispatched from base camp, but would need considerable time to arrive. Before the rescue team could reach the location, the carabiner connecting Ian's tether to the rope failed under sustained stress and cold conditions. He fell further onto an ice ledge inside the crevasse. Rescue specialists reached the crevasse by mid-morning and rappelled down to Ian. He was already dead. His body was brought out later that day. Physical inspection of the failed anchor revealed serious issues with the installation Anders had cleared as safe. The ice quality was marginal and should have been flagged. Technical experts compared Anders's inspection photos against what proper documentation required. His images showed only wide-angle shots of the crossing, with no close-ups of individual anchor points, ice quality assessment, or load testing evidence. The metadata confirmed he had taken 6 photos over 7 minutes, then left. Video footage from climbers who witnessed the failure was analyzed alongside Anders's photos. The videos clearly showed anchor configurations and ice conditions that any trained inspector would have identified as inadequate. One climber's footage, shot hours before the crossing opened, showed the soft, sun-affected ice Anders should have flagged. His documentation showed he had spent insufficient time for thorough assessment and had photographed the crossing from distances that concealed the problems. The expedition company suspended operations and brought in independent experts to reassess every section Anders had cleared. Multiple other crossings were found with similar problems, all with Anders's cursory photo documentation. His certification documents trace back to incomplete training with no accreditation. A harrowing example of that happened on May 7, 2023, at the base of Everest's Lhotse face, at approximately 23,600 feet. Darian Lambert was 28 years old, a marketing coordinator from Tempe, Arizona, who had spent the last 3 years building an adventure content account on Instagram that sat, at the time of his death, at just under 2,100 followers. He was not a professional climber. He was not an amateur with serious credentials. He had completed 2 guided hikes in Patagonia, one via Ferrata route in the Dolomites, and a trekking permit ascent to Everest Base Camp in 2022 that he had documented extensively on social media. Crampons in frame, oxygen mask pushed photogenically to one side, the kind of content that performs well with a small audience that cannot yet distinguish base camp from a summit attempt. He had returned to Nepal in April 2023 with a stated goal that he had posted about publicly and repeatedly: a faster, unfiltered route to the top, away from the crowds and the commercialized lines. He used the phrase "the real Everest" at least 11 times across his posts. I want to be careful here, because it's easy to reduce Darian to a punchline, and he wasn't one. He was just a young man who genuinely believed what he was selling himself. He had connected with a guy named Bishal, no agency affiliation, no certification traceable to any registered body, through a network of private climbing forums where unofficial arrangements were discussed in language just indirect enough to avoid being explicit. Darian had paid approximately $9,200 for the arrangement, which included a route that bypassed 2 of the standard checkpoints by using a secondary glacial approach corridor on the western edge of the Lhotse face. Bishal knew the unofficial corridor. He had used it before on permitted climbs and understood its technical requirements. What Darian had posted publicly, that he had found a faster way, that the commercial routes were for people who couldn't handle the real thing, bore no relationship to what Bishal had actually told him. The corridor was not faster. It was less monitored. Those are different things. The secondary corridor Bishal used sits west of those ropes, on ice that receives less foot traffic and therefore less monitoring for deterioration. Blue ice under a surface wind crust, technically demanding to front point and even in good conditions. Darian had used crampons on moderate terrain before. He had never front pointed on 50-degree glacial ice at altitude. They moved at 4:20 a.m. on May 7th. Bishal led. Darian followed on a short rope, his technique visible in the way Bishal later described it: functional on flat sections, breaking down on steeper pitches, crampon placements shallow and inconsistent. This is where I have to be direct. Bishal's statement said that he knew within the first hour that Darian's technical ability did not match what the route required. He continued anyway. By 7:40 a.m., they had reached approximately 24,200 feet. Darian had stopped twice to photograph the view. At 8:15 a.m., on a 52-degree pitch approximately 600 feet above their last rest point, Darian's left crampon lost purchase. The placement had been on the outer 2 points rather than all 10, a common common error on steep ice for climbers without adequate training. The crampon did not pop. It sheared laterally as his weight shifted, the front point skidding sideways across the surface. He went down immediately, both hands going to the ice instinctively, without a tool in either. He had been carrying his ice axe clipped to his pack for the last 40 minutes of moderate terrain. The short rope between them went taut and yanked Bichal off his stance before he could anchor. Both men fell. Bichal self-arrested after approximately 35 feet, driving his axe into a patch of softer ice at the edge of a slight depression. The rope jerked him hard enough to separate his left shoulder, partially from the socket, confirmed later by medical examination. Darian continued past him. The rope, a 30-foot section of 8mm cord Bichal used for client connection on approach terrain, went to full extension and then snapped at the knot joining it to Darian's harness. A knot that subsequent inspection suggested had been tied incorrectly, possibly by Darian himself the previous evening. Darian fell approximately 400 feet before a natural Bergschrund feature, a crevasse where the glacier pulls away from the rock face, interrupted the fall. He came to rest partially inside it. Bichal, shoulder partially dislocated, descended alone to the nearest fixed rope and made contact with a Sherpa team, ascending the standard route at approximately 9:50 a.m. That team radioed base camp. A response team reached Darian's position at 1:35 p.m., roughly 5 hours and 20 minutes after the fall. Bichal was treated at a regional medical facility and released. No criminal charges were filed. His name does not appear in any registered guide database. Darian's final post, uploaded from base camp 4 days before his death, shows him looking directly at the camera with the Khumbu icefall behind him. The account was taken down months later. I can't help but feel it's a tragedy that could have been avoided. Darian's ambition and social media obsession just weren't enough against the mountain. It was April 27, 2013, at Everest Base Camp on the southern Nepal approach. Base camp sat at an elevation where altitude sickness was common and each expedition company was required to have medical coverage on site. Seth Austin was 31, hired as the primary medic for a mid-sized expedition, managing a dozen clients. His resume listed wilderness emergency medical certification and high-altitude medicine training. He had provided references from previous overseas work and copies of credential documents. The company, working within a limited budget, had checked his references but never verified the credentials through issuing organizations. What they never discovered was that Seth had not completed legitimate medical certification. He had volunteered with a ski patrol doing basic first aid and completed a weekend wilderness course, but had fabricated the advanced qualifications. His knowledge of altitude illness came from internet research and observation. He had worked one season at a base camp on a different mountain, where his duties had been limited to treating blisters, dispensing pain medication, and monitoring basic symptoms. Seth's responsibilities included evaluating clients for altitude sickness, determining if climbers were healthy enough to go higher, and managing medical emergencies. He had access to oxygen, altitude medications, and other equipment, but his understanding of proper protocols and dosing was incomplete. The day before the incident, a client named Paul Douglas, 47, returned from a climb to the first camp complaining of headache, fatigue, and nausea, common complaints at altitude. Seth evaluated him and concluded it was a normal adjustment to elevation, recommending rest and hydration. By that evening, Paul's headache had worsened. He returned to the medical area. Seth checked his oxygen levels, low but not unusual for base camp, gave him pain medication, and told him to keep resting. Standard procedure for worsening symptoms at that elevation included supplemental oxygen and careful monitoring for serious altitude illness. Seth provided neither, deciding Paul's condition was moderate. The next morning, Paul's tent mate found him barely responsive. He had been sick during the night, and his breathing was irregular. The tent mate ran for Seth. Seth reached Paul's tent within minutes. Paul was semi-conscious, breathing fast and shallow, with a blue tint to his lips, a visible sign of severe oxygen deprivation. Nearby climbers, some already filming their base camp experience, captured the emergency response. What the footage captured was telling. Seth put Paul on oxygen but didn't perform a proper assessment or check vital signs systematically. He radioed the expedition leader, saying Paul was ill but failed to convey the severity. Over the next half hour, Paul's condition continued to deteriorate. A medic from a neighboring monitoring expedition, hearing the commotion, came to help. The cameras caught the moment he arrived and immediately took control, his quick, systematic assessment contrasting sharply with Seth's hesitant movements. He asked Seth if he had administered emergency altitude medications. The footage clearly recorded Seth's response. He said he had not, explaining he thought Paul had a stomach problem. The second medic's visible disbelief was captured on camera as he quickly gave the necessary medication and began coordinating a helicopter evacuation. Paul's oxygen levels were dangerously low. The second medic placed him in a portable pressure chamber to simulate lower elevation while they waited for the helicopter. Video showed Seth standing to the side, helping only when directed, while the other medic worked efficiently. The contrast was stark. The helicopter arrived and Paul was loaded aboard. Radio communication during the flight brought worsening news. Paul was deteriorating despite oxygen and medication. He lost consciousness during transport. The helicopter reached the medical facility, but Paul was declared dead shortly after landing. The investigation that followed drew heavily on the video evidence captured by base camp witnesses. Recordings showed Seth had failed to recognize and treat severe altitude sickness during the crucial window when intervention could have mattered. The footage documented his failure to perform proper assessments, his inability to recognize obvious warning signs, and the moment a real medical professional arrived and immediately identified what Seth had missed. When the company requested verification of Seth's certifications after reviewing the footage, he could not produce them. The organization listed on his resume had no record of him. His references confirmed he had only ever worked limited first aid roles. The documents were fabricated. Medical experts concluded early intervention would have significantly improved Paul's chances of survival. Seth faced criminal charges for fraud and practicing without credentials. The cameras that climbers had brought to document their adventure became the record of how his deception had proven fatal. It was April 29, 2018, on the south col of Everest, at roughly 26,300 feet above sea level. Nobody flagged a man's permit at base camp because it looked exactly right. The lamination, the formatting, the expedition company letterhead, all of it clean. The liaison officer listed, a man named in the documentation as attached to a registered trekking agency out of Tamil, didn't exist in any government roster. The climber who carried these papers had paid approximately $8,000 for them through a middleman operating out of a guest house near the central bus station in Kathmandu, against the official government royalty fee that runs close to $11,000 per person for a standard Southside permit. He had arrived at base camp in late April with a small independent team, none of whom appear to have known the permit was fraudulent. Checkpoint staff at the icefall examined the documents twice. Both times, they passed. This is the part that genuinely disturbs me. The permit wasn't sloppy. Whoever made it knew exactly what real permits looked like. What is known about the man comes almost entirely from accounts given after his body was found the following spring, and from a single satellite phone log recovered by the team he had climbed with. He was described by teammates as experienced, methodical, not reckless. He had summited 2 other peaks above 7,000 meters in the years prior. He carried quality gear. He acclimated properly and made no unusual decisions below Camp 3. His stated goal was a clean summit push and descent within a 36-hour weather window that forecasts had shown opening around April 30th. By all observable behavior, he was a competent high-altitude climber who had simply found a way around a system that priced him out. The route above the South Col turns hostile fast. Above 8,000 meters, the body stops absorbing oxygen efficiently, regardless of supplemental flow rate, and judgment degrades in ways the climber often cannot perceive. The Hillary Step, a near vertical rock band sitting at roughly 28,839 feet, requires both physical precision and sharp decision-making. That season, conditions on the upper mountain had been complicated by an unusual late-season jet stream, and at least 3 other climbers had reported significantly higher wind than forecast near the summit ridge on April 29th and 30th. I've read dozens of accounts from this exact stretch of mountain. The thing people don't convey well is how narrow the margin is. Not dramatic, just narrow. At some point between Camp 4 and the Hillary Step, the man became separated from his teammates. The precise timeline is unclear, but the satellite log shows his last outgoing communication at approximately 11:40 p.m. on April 29th. A brief, fragmented transmission that the recipient later described as difficult to parse due to wind noise. The team continued their summit bid. He did not. What happened in the hours that followed left only physical evidence. When teammates descended and reported him missing, a search was not immediately mounted. At that altitude, with weather deteriorating, the calculus of a search becomes brutal. No helicopter can operate effectively above roughly 20,000 feet. Ground rescue above 8,000 meters is nearly impossible without jeopardizing additional lives. The team radioed base camp. By the time the report was relayed and assessed, there was nothing actionable. Nobody talks about how the decision not to search is often the correct one. But I think that doesn't make it easier. His body was found the following season, May 2019, wedged into a crevasse feature just below the Hillary Step, at approximately 28,700 feet. He had suffered severe frostbite to all extremities, consistent with extended exposure at extreme altitude. The position of the body suggested a fall of moderate distance. Not a catastrophic drop, but enough. There was no evidence of a belay anchor or fixed line attachment at the point of the fall. His oxygen system showed the regulator had been set correctly, but the cylinder was nearly empty, suggesting either a longer climb than planned or a leak that went unnoticed. There was bruising consistent with repeated blunt impact to the left side of the torso and head, likely from the rock face during the fall. Death was attributed to a combination of hypoxia, exposure, and trauma. Time of death was estimated as sometime between midnight and 4 a.m. on April 30th, 2018. There was no government file because the expedition he was registered under did not officially exist. The trekking agency listed on the permit had no record of him. When the body was reported, authorities had no name to attach to the case, only a physical description, a partial gear inventory, and a satellite phone number that traced back to a prepaid account registered to an address in a city that no longer matched any current resident. I think the system didn't fail him. He used the system's gaps deliberately. That's not a loophole story. That's a disappearance by design. It was May 14th, 2017, at the high camp on the south col of Mount Everest. Weather had been cooperative for days, with temperatures well below zero and moderate winds. Forecasts indicated good conditions for the next morning's summit attempts. Vera Thorne was 52, a physician from Ontario attempting Everest as part of a commercial expedition. She had summited other major peaks and understood high-altitude medicine well. Her expedition package included multiple oxygen bottles for summit day, plus a reserve at camp. The expedition was led by Ryan Bishop, 38, a guide with several Everest summits who ran a small guiding business. His service was priced competitively, not premium, not budget, achieved by carefully controlling expenses. What Vera and the other clients never knew was that Ryan had been collecting partially used oxygen bottles and redistributing them as full. When clients turned back early or used less oxygen than allocated, Ryan gathered their bottles and gave them to others without tracking remaining contents. The pressure gauges still showed pressure, but actual oxygen volume was significantly less. His record showed he had purchased far fewer new bottles than he had distributed, with considerable cost savings. The evening before summit day, Ryan briefed his clients. Departure was scheduled for late that night. Estimated time to the summit was most of a day, with a mandatory turnaround time of mid-morning, regardless of progress. Vera and the team left high camp near midnight. Several members were documenting the climb with helmet cameras and phones. The route followed gradual snow slopes before steepening toward the balcony. Vera reached it in the early morning hours and switched to her second bottle. The gauge on her first had run down faster than expected. She mentioned this to Ryan on camera. He suggested she was probably breathing harder than usual. By mid-morning, Vera felt sluggish at significant altitude. Ryan checked her equipment and oxygen flow. Everything appeared normal. Her second bottle gauge showed less than half remaining. He calculated she could make the summit and descend to where emergency oxygen was cached. His calculation was based on how full bottles normally performed, not accounting for the fact that hers were already partially depleted. Vera reached the difficult rock step below the summit later that morning. Her gauge was reading low. The summit was still above her. She asked Ryan if she should turn around. Focused on client success and convinced she had enough oxygen, he told her she could make it to the top and back down to the emergency supply. Vera summited. Another client photographed the celebration. Images that would later show faded markings and labels inconsistent with new equipment. Her bottle gauge was nearly empty. She took her photos and started down. Shortly into her descent, the oxygen ran out completely. She was still well above the emergency cache. Ryan, descending with another client, learned the situation via radio and told Vera to move as fast as she could. Her pace slowed dramatically. Other climbers passing her later said she was sitting free frequently and seemed confused. Two climbers with helmet cameras captured her deteriorating condition during their own descent. Over the following hours, Vera covered very little distance. Ryan reached her with his own bottle running low. He shared oxygen intermittently, but had little remaining. When he called for help, no other guides were positioned to assist. Eventually, Vera stopped moving. Ryan tried to rouse her, but she was unresponsive. He kept sharing what oxygen remained until his bottle ran out entirely. A rescue team reached Vera's position early that afternoon. She had no vital signs. Ryan was severely hypothermic and required assistance getting down. The investigation that followed proved damning. Examiners found markings on Vera's bottles, indicating prior use. Summit photos showed faded labels and old expedition markings from weeks earlier. One client's helmet camera footage, filmed at high camp the night before departure, showed Ryan distributing bottles with visible wear and partially obscured labels, details no one had noticed in the dark. Another climber had filmed his oxygen setup at the balcony. His bottle showed remnants of tape with a previous client's name scratched off. Ryan's inventory system was found to be deliberately vague, listing bottles only by count rather than individual tracking. The evidence was systematic and undeniable. Vera's oxygen had depleted far earlier than it should have. Her death was attributed to oxygen deprivation during descent. Ryan's permits were permanently revoked, his company shut down, and criminal fraud charges were filed. The cameras his clients carried to document their achievement became the primary evidence of how he had endangered them all. It was May 11th, 2021, on the upper southeast ridge of Everest, at 8,400 meters, where the air holds roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level, and every decision a person makes is being made by a brain that is, in measurable and dangerous ways, no longer fully itself. Prael Sung was 47 years old, a logistics director for a regional freight company based in Chengdu, and by any reasonable accounting, a man who had earned the right to want something purely for himself. Everest was not an impulsive choice. He had researched it for 4 years, saved deliberately, and ultimately selected a guide not through a registered agency, but through a private referral. A name passed through a business contact who described the man as someone who could make the logistics work regardless of the timeline. Prael had paid the equivalent of $67,000 for the arrangement. No permit was filed in his name. I want to be clear about something before we go further. Prael wasn't naive. He knew something about this arrangement with the guide was irregular. He chose it anyway, and that choice is part of this story. The guide was known in base camp circles by the name Tarku. No surname given in any account, no agency affiliation traceable after the fact. He was, by multiple second-hand descriptions from other guides who recognized him at base camp that season, a technically exceptional climber, calm under pressure, efficient on fixed lines, and experienced enough on the southeast ridge to move without consulting a route card. He had guided permitted climbs for 15 years, accumulated a reputation as reliable if expensive, and then, at some point, no one agrees on exactly when, began taking private arrangements that left no paper trail. The money on those arrangements was reportedly double or triple standard rates. The part that gets me is that Tarku knew this mountain the way some people know their own house. That knowledge is exactly what made the silence so deliberate. They had moved through the dead hours, 1 a.m. to 4 a.m., using a secondary approach line that bypassed the fixed rope queues entirely. Tarku had used it before on permitted climbs and knew its technical requirements. They reached 8,400 meters at approximately 5:30 a.m. A registered South Korean expedition was moving on the standard line approximately 200 meters to the east. Accounts from that team describe hearing no voices, seeing no headlamps in the secondary corridor at that time. Prael sat down. That detail comes from Tarku's own account, given privately to one person months later, and recounted secondhand. Not a controlled rest, a sit, sudden and total, with no verbal indication beforehand. Tarku recognized it. At 8,400 meters, in a man who had been moving continuously for over 4 hours on a non-standard line, that kind of collapse has a narrow list of causes, and none of them resolve without descent. Supplemental oxygen, and in the worst cases, medication that Tarku may or may not have been carrying in adequate supply. What Tarku had was a satellite communicator, and the knowledge that using it meant documenting 2 people who had no legal right to be where they were. A distress call would bring a response, but it would also bring questions. Every answer to those questions had consequences that were professionally terminal. He administered what supplemental oxygen he had. He attempted to move Pryal manually, which at that altitude and body weight was close to physically impossible for one person without mechanical assistance. Pryal's condition did not improve. His breathing became audible, labored, with irregular gaps that grew longer through the morning hours. By approximately 9:10 a.m., it stopped. Coroner findings were never formally recorded due to absence of documentation and non-recovery of remains. Based on the second-hand account and circumstantial altitude data, probable cause of death: high-altitude cerebral edema with possible concurrent pulmonary involvement, occurring at approximately 8,400 meters on the southeast ridge on the morning of May 11, 2021. No autopsy was performed. No body was recovered or formally reported. Tarku descended alone and tried to blend back into base camp's general population, filing no incident report and contacting no authority. But Pryal's family did not stop searching. Months of inquiries, missing person reports, and cross-checking private permits ultimately led local Chengdu authorities to locate and arrest Tarku. The arrest is how the full sequence of events came to light. It was July 19, 2013, on the glacial approaches of Mont Blanc at roughly 13,000 feet above the French-Italian border, where the mountain holds its coldest rule. That altitude does not negotiate, and ice does not warn. Jonas Vermeer was 28 and worked as a structural engineer at a civil firm in Ghent, Belgium. He had 2 prior alpine climbs on his record, one guided and one not, and carried himself the way people do when competence in one field starts bleeding into confidence in another. His partners, Felix Durant, 29, a physics teacher, and Simon Leclerc, 27, a logistics coordinator, had trained together at an indoor climbing center in Brussels for 6 months. Jonas was the one with glacier experience, however limited, and the group defaulted to him as led by quiet consensus. They had researched route advisories, identified the standard guided approach, and then chosen against that route, partly to avoid cost, partly crowds, and partly because Jonas had done something similar before and nothing had gone wrong. Still, I can't imagine having that kind of reasoning that made them think this is a good idea, regardless of their preparation. July 2013 had been an unusually warm month at altitude. Melt cycles were accelerating snowpack instability across the glacier field in ways that weren't visible in any weather brief they consulted. They departed at 1 a.m. with crampons, ice axes, a rope, and headlamps. Their rope discipline was loose. They kept nearly 40 feet between climbers, but the line sagged slack across the snow, offering the appearance of connection without its function. Jonas moved roughly 40 feet ahead, the others following. A mountain hut sat roughly 400 feet above and east of their route, staffed by a seasonal worker who had spent 6 years at that elevation. He noticed 3 headlamps moving laterally through a section of glacier known for widening summer crevasses. He watched for several minutes, initially assuming they were retreating. They were not. The temperature had dropped just enough to make the surface feel firm underfoot, but the crust concealed snow bridges weakened by repeated melt and refreeze cycles, and under high-altitude darkness, glacier terrain reads as flat and continuous. Nothing marks the difference between solid ice and a snow bridge spanning open vertical space until the bridge is already gone. The hut worker later described the sound as muffled. Not a crack, more like something folding inward quietly. And then Jonas's headlamp simply was not there anymore. He fell into a crevasse. Felix and Simon stopped within feet of the opening. Felix dropped to his knees at the rim and extended his ice tool downward, calling Jonas's name. Simon drove his axe into the snowpack as an anchor and grabbed Felix's harness. The slack rope never came tight enough to arrest the fall. The crevasse, later estimated at over 90 feet deep in that section, returned brief sounds, the soft percussion of gear contacting ice walls, and then nothing. Felix stayed at the edge for approximately 3 minutes. Simon pulled him back when he noticed fine stress lines spreading outward from the rim through the surrounding snowpack, still fracturing under their weight. The hut worker had already reached for his emergency radio. Services were contacted within roughly 10 minutes of the collapse. A glacier rescue team arrived at the site in approximately 1.5 hours, but halted descent due to the unstable lip of the crevasse and the risk of a secondary collapse under rescue load. Thermal scanning returned no detectable heat signature under the ice conditions, but rescuers could not rule out survival survivability from that alone. Probing was suspended before dawn. No full recovery of remains was possible within the primary operation window. Felix and Simon were treated as surviving witnesses in official reporting. I think this incident papers over something harder to name. 3 men made a decision that was understandable the way bad decisions often are, each step smaller than the last, until the final step goes somewhere you cannot come back from. It was January 9th, 2015, on the southern approach to the Atlas Range in Morocco, where a mountain known for swallowing unprepared climbers in winter sat under a fresh accumulation of overnight snow that had not yet settled into anything resembling stability. The kind of morning where the conditions are already writing the ending, and the only variable left is who walks into it. Samuel Polanski, 31, was a warehouse logistics coordinator from Leeds who spent his limited vacation time doing things most people read about and move on from. He was not a mountaineer in any formal sense. He had completed 2 trekking expeditions in South America and 1 in Nepal. Apparently, he moved through those trips efficiently, cheaply, and with a baseline confidence that tended to read as competence to people who didn't know him well. His travel partner, Adrian Chavez, 33, was a secondary school physical education teacher from Manchester, who had summited the same peak once before, in July, under dry conditions with a group. That single summer ascent seemed to have become the reference point for everything that followed. Bypassing the checkpoint was illegal but deliberate, the kind of calculated decision made weeks earlier at a kitchen table. They believed 2 experienced trekkers, one with summit experience, didn't need a guide for a well-researched route. It's the same reasoning seen in many fatal cases, treating licensing as a revenue scheme rather than a real safety measure. That logic is not unusual. It only fails once. By early morning, the temperature sat around 14 degrees Fahrenheit at the upper elevations. The snowpack above 12,500 feet had been building for 3 days over an older wind-compressed base layer. 3 separate mule handlers working the lower trail had warned passing groups to avoid the high traverse. One of them, stationed near a stone marker at roughly 12,100 feet, watched Samuel and Adrian move past without stopping and continue upward into terrain marked for guided access only. I don't think either of them believed the warnings applied to them specifically. That gap between general caution and personal risk is where most of these stories live. The slope they entered was wide and convex, the kind of feature that holds snow unevenly and releases in sheets. The sky was flat and gray. The wind had dropped, which made the silence above feel heavier than it should have. The handler said the 2 men were perhaps 400 feet above him when he heard it. Not a crack exactly, more a low compressive shift, something dense moving under pressure, felt in the chest before it registered as sound. Samuel was leading. The handler watched the snow beneath him separate along a clean horizontal line, a slab fracture roughly 30 feet across, before the entire mass began moving as a single piece. It accelerated fast. Samuel did not turn. The handler estimated full burial took closer to 6 to 8 seconds from fracture to complete burial. Adrian, trailing by roughly 10 feet, turned uphill and attempted to move upward but was immediately overtaken as the slab propagated and folded over him within moments of the initial release. A pair of hikers lower on the trail later told investigators they saw Adrian's upper body briefly above the surface, arms moving, pulling at snow, before he disappeared entirely. No one shouted. There was no sound from either man after the initial fracture. The mule handler radioed a regional emergency post within approximately 8 minutes. Mountain rescue teams reached the lower staging area roughly 2 hours later, but could not ascend immediately due to continued slope instability. Recovery was halted until the following morning, where they found both bodies dead. Coroner findings noted both men died from asphyxiation and compressive thoracic trauma, consistent with avalanche burial. British consular services were notified following identification of the victims, and coordination with local authorities remained procedural and limited to repatriation formalities. In the United Kingdom, the incident appeared only briefly in niche trekking forums and small-scale outdoor safety discussions, without broader media amplification. That's part of the problem. When the story doesn't travel far, the lesson doesn't either. 2 men are buried on a mountain in January, and the clearest thing the record shows is that they were warned at least 4 times by people who knew that slope, and they kept walking. That is not a failure of information. That is something harder to fix, and I'm not sure what fixes it.